When one thinks about multiple murderers, one generally thinks about nondescript middle-aged men who have built up to murder over many years, usually graduating from less serious and less violent crimes. But this isn't always the case, especially when the perpetrator has a horrible childhood. Anthony Arkwright was just 21 years old when he killed at least 3 people, and most likely 4, over a 56-hour period in 1988. This spree killer is not especially well known even within true crime circles. So let's have a look at this delightful little cherub. This is Murder of Crows. Wath-upon-Dearne is a small town in South Yorkshire, between the larger towns of Doncaster and Barnsley. From a prosperous time during the boom of the mining industry, it became another victim of the demise of that industry and struggled to find an ongoing identity. Though it does have something of a reputation for the folk-centric Wath Festival, established by the town's Morris dancing team in 1972. If you don't know what Morris dancing is, look it up. You will find it extremely illuminating. And by the time of its 40th anniversary, it had hosted the likes of Fairport Convention and Eddie Reader. But 5 years before those Morris dancers had founded the town's festival, Anthony Paul Arkwright was born in the town in 1967. He was one of 5 children and was abandoned by his mother at an early age. Along with the attachment issues this would have resulted in, Arkwright's father was a hard-working miner, not cut out to bring up 5 children alone, resulting in the attachment issues being compounded by spending a lot of his childhood in the care system, and in particular in group homes. Whether through a desire for attention or just generally being a bad egg, the old nature versus nurture argument occurring in real time here, his performance in school was generally poor, and his aimless drifting led him into a life of petty crime and then ultimately spending time in a borstal. Undoubtedly a damaging environment for an obviously already damaged child. Arkwright would presumably have been plagued with thoughts about how unfair life was, and this was no doubt exacerbated by rumours in the town that he was the result of an incestuous relationship between his mother and his grandfather. By 1988, Arkwright had managed to find a job at a scrap merchant's in nearby Mexborough, So he was clearly trying his best to be productive and find a sense of purpose. But it would be his own actions, or more accurately inactions, that would prove his undoing in this regard. He was finally sacked from this job on the 26th of August 1988 for poor attendance. And for whatever reason, this seemed to be something of a last straw for the erratic young man. And it would be the kickstart for what would develop into a 56-hour murder spree. After the sacking, Arkwright returned to Wath, and in a completely unprovoked attack on his own grandfather. Stanislav Podolskis was 67 years old and was working on his allotment when Arkwright found him and immediately stabbed him so aggressively that Stanislav was immediately paralyzed. Not satisfied with brutally attacking and critically injuring his own grandfather, Arkwright then dragged the defenseless man, who, unable to move, must have been terrified, into a nearby shed. He then found a 14-pound or 6.7 kilogram lump hammer and caved in his own grandfather's skull. Now, this must have been hard work for Arkwright, and having developed something of a thirst, he embarked on a bit of a pub crawl in Mexborough. He didn't seem remotely concerned by what he had done, and showed himself to be an absolute master of comedy, as he was quoted as saying, "It's been murder on the allotment today." Funny, but maybe a tad too soon, Anthony. It is assumed, though Arkwright was never convicted on this account, that he also killed his grandfather's housekeeper, 73-year-old Elsa Cronadite, while in the process of stealing his grandfather's savings of £3,000. The bodies of his grandfather and housekeeper were not found for almost a week. Now, at this point of his actions, apparently having sated his thirst, he must have felt that the murders to this point were not nearly grisly enough. So he set about making a statement with his next killing, and he knew just the victim. One of Arkwright's neighbours was an unemployed teacher named Raymond Ford. Now, Ford was a meek, mild-mannered man who had a previous career as a teacher, but was unemployed at that time. Arkwright had been bullying Ford for some time, and Ford had reported Arkwright to the police for stealing items from him. So when his thoughts became murderous, Arkwright earmarked the former teacher as an easy target. So at 3 a.m. on the 28th of August, Arkwright entered Ford's flat completely naked except for wearing a devil mask, as you do. In what can only be described as a rageful frenzy, he stabbed Ford between 250 and 540 times before draping his entrails, Ford's that is, Arkwright's were still within his own torso, around the room, and internal organs were scattered around the corridor and the hallway. Then, in a case of truth being stranger than fiction, and a truth being so amazing that you couldn't write it, after he'd gone home to shower, since he'd got a tadly little bit of Ford's blood on him, the police arrived at Arkwright's flat at between 7 and 8 a.m. to arrest him for the previous theft from Ford's flat, not knowing that Ford's body, or what was left of it, was in the flat nearby. Arkwright was interrogated for 3 hours about the theft and was bailed to appear in court the following week. So, having felt like he'd sidestepped something of a landmine, Arkwright decided to celebrate with, yep, you've guessed it, another pub crawl, but with no crappy puns this time as far as I'm aware. Then the next day, on the 29th of August 1988, it was time for Arkwright to up the ante once again. And like before, he chose a victim that was an easy target. On the opposite side of Arkwright's flat to that of Raymond Ford was the bungalow residence of 25-year-old Marcus Law. Marcus Law lived in the bungalow, which had been specially adapted as he had been left in a wheelchair as a result of injuries suffered in a motorbike accident some years earlier. Now, Arkwright was apparently miffed at Law because of the young disabled man's tendency to constantly beg cigarettes from Arkwright. If ever there was a case for justifiable homicide, then taking a few too smokes from a neighbour you're friendly with is right up there, don't you think? Anyway, the wheelchair-bound man was no match for a frenzied Arkwright, who entered the bungalow and stabbed Law around 70 times. He then tried to gut the poor man, but for some reason he failed. But he was still far from done with the disabled man. He inserted one of Law's own crutches into a stomach wound and gouged his eyes out, before, in a nod to the excessive taking of cigarettes, he stuck cigarettes into his ears, mouth, and obviously his now empty eye sockets. Wow, he sounds like a keeper, eh, ladies? The next morning, Marcus Law's mother, who visited regularly to help with his care needs, entered his bungalow and found the horrifying sight of her son's mutilated body. She immediately called authorities, who very quickly, given Law's very limited social circle, made Arkwright a person of interest. And then, looking into Arkwright, they wanted to speak to people he was previously linked to. With this in mind, Raymond Ford, on account of his recent accusations of theft against Arkwright, was somebody they wanted to talk to. PC David Winter went to the Denham Road flat of Raymond Ford and found the second horrific scene of the day. Police now knew they were looking for a violent double murderer, and they were urgently seeking Arkwright, who was soon arrested. Arkwright knew at this stage that he was pretty much fucked, so he confessed to 4 murders. 4? The police still only had 2 bodies, so they began a frantic search for the other 2 murder victims. This led to the eventual finding of his grandfather and the housekeeper. And then attention turned to building the case against Arkwright for trial. At this stage, Arkwright, quite rightly, was left to rot on remand until the trial. Infuriated and frustrated at the lack of attention and control, led Arkwright to create a completely fictitious fifth victim to get some further attention. And this led to further searches of bodies of water within the local area, but nothing was ever found in this regard. Oi. With the case moving nearer to the point of the trial and Arkwright's attempts to garner further attention having failed, his mind moved towards trial strategy, and we all know the game criminals like to play. He decided to play the age-old "I'm a fucking crackpot, I'm as mad as a box of frogs, me" card. So with this in mind, he smeared the walls of his own cell at HMP Hull, where he was being held on remand. Smeared the walls of his cell with his own excrement in protest at not getting the respect he felt that he deserved. Well, shit happens, I suppose. Now, in order for the authorities to try to head off the insanity defence that Arkwright seemed to be employing, Arkwright was moved to the high security Rampton Hospital in Nottinghamshire to be assessed. Somewhat unsurprisingly, the psychiatrists at that establishment found him sane to stand trial, with one doctor even quoted as saying he was the sanest person in the building. Didn't quite work out, did it? Nice try, Anthony, but your batshit needs some work, I would say. At trial at Sheffield Crown Court in July 1989, when Arkwright would have been 22, he pled guilty to 3 counts of murder. The case of the murder of Arkwright's grandfather's housekeeper, Elsa Cronodite, was unproven from an evidential standpoint. So the charge in that case was not progressed to the court case, but the charge was ordered by the judge to remain on Arkwright's file. Arkwright was initially sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 25 years to serve. In something of an understatement, I would say, Arkwright was described during the proceedings as an evil fantasist. It's like saying Hitler was a bit of a bad lad. Anywho, the following year, the UK's Home Secretary David Blunkett changed the law to allow, in certain situations of excess force, damage, cruelty, or the sheer number of victims, the applying of a whole life order, meaning that there would be no chance of parole, and life would indeed mean life. Arkwright's case was one of the first to have this change applied to their sentence. And I mean, it's pretty unsurprising considering the cruelty and depravity that Arkwright showed during his crimes. But Arkwright, along with another infamous murderer, Arthur Hutchinson, who had also been given a whole life order, they appealed to the High Court, saying that the whole life order amounted to inhumane and degrading treatment. God, if anybody deserved it, it was this fellow, wasn't it? But the appeal was denied, with the appeal court ruling that the whole life orders were in fact compatible with the European Convention of Human Rights. Have some of that, Anthony Arkwright. He is still the youngest person to ever receive a whole life tariff, having been 21 when he committed the crimes and 22 upon his sentencing. So there we have the 56-hour killing spree of Anthony Arkwright, which, to my surprise, is not especially widely known. 4 people, all of whom were easy targets in one way or another, had their lives cut short to fulfill the murderous needs of one selfish arsehole. As ever, this video is dedicated to the victims. These 4 people whose misfortune was to cross paths with this absolute fuckwit. Thank you for watching another episode of Murder of Crows. I'm Steve. This orange permonger is Samson. And we will see you when we see you. Say